Polymatter is a popular YouTube creator who has spent the past decade crafting educational and analytical videos. Their chosen topics of business, technology, and geopolitics, combined with slick motion graphics, have proved successful, racking up hundreds of millions of views and about 2 million subscribers to date. I've watched their videos for years and always found them engaging, admiring Polymatter's ability to break down complex subjects into accessible narratives, and I'd say the channel is a respected staple of the educational YouTube community, alongside creators like Wendover Productions, Real Life Lore, and Half as Interesting. All part of the Nebula Mafia that I definitely don't desperately want to join. However, Polymatter's recent video concerning Apple has not received the usual response. The 10 videos before this one all have an average dislike rate of under 5%, while this most recent one adds a 0. And the comments tell a similar story. So what's going on here? Well, the video concerns the antitrust lawsuit filed by the United States government against Apple Inc. Polymatter looks at 5 examples of alleged illegal behavior by Apple and ranks these based on whether they think the behaviors are detrimental to Apple's customers. Many viewers seem to think that Polymatter makes bad faith arguments in this video, leaves out important context, and overall comes across as having a strong bias in Apple's favor. Some even go so far as to accuse Polymatter of taking money from Apple on the sly, which I think is insane, but I do think there is a lot more to the story of this lawsuit than what Polymatter chooses to tell, which is why I've done this. This is the complaint put forward by the US government. Actually, it's half of it because I printed on both sides. And today we're going to look at this and the Polymatter video in detail and see how it holds up. And in the interest of not being a total hypocrite, let me be clear about one thing. I largely agree with the points put forward by the US government. In other words, if the Polymatter video is biased, then this video certainly is. My intent is not to show both sides of the argument with equal credence and weight. In fact, we haven't even heard the extent of Apple's counter-arguments because the trial is likely to go on for years. My intent is to turn this into something more digestible and to create a counterbalance to the allegedly biased presentation in the Polymatter video. I will also make my own assessment about whether the Polymatter video actually is biased, so stick around for that tasty drama. But to have a chance of understanding any of this at all, we are going to have to start with a history lesson. Which is a shame, because I personally don't care about history at all. Apple in the 1990s was a struggling company in the personal computer market where there was one dominant player, Microsoft. Apple had been first to create an operating system with a graphical user interface, but by the mid-80s, Microsoft had followed suit, or as Apple would say, Microsoft had copied them. Bill Gates set the aim that only applications that take advantage of Windows should be competitive in the long run, and by the 90s, their operating system was gaining traction, while Apple fell behind, preoccupied with a bloated and confusing product line. I know you've heard of the iPad, but have you heard of the Newton Message Pad? How about the Pippin? I think it's fair to say they've gotten better at advertising. By 1997, Apple was reporting losses of hundreds of millions of dollars per quarter. And though Apple and Microsoft struck a deal that helped turn things around, Steve Jobs still criticized Microsoft for dirty monopoly tactics, and Apple did go to the Department of Justice in hopes of getting Microsoft to play fair. Microsoft, meanwhile, was doing very well, with their Windows 95 taking great strides in OS design and taking the market by storm.
This is Jennifer Aniston. I'm Matthew Perry. We're here to see Mr. Bill Gates about a possible starring role in the video guide to Microsoft Windows 95.
You know, I'll tell you something, I've learned so much, I feel like I've already been a part of the Windows 95 video.
Yeah, I know. It's an incredible program, isn't it? I think I'm going to press that red button.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Windows. I know Windows.
But there was one threat looming on the horizon. And no, it wasn't Apple.
A year ago, this place didn't exist. Today, it's the fastest growing firm in the digital world, worth more than $100 a share. Netscape makes Magic Cookies, among other things, principally the most popular program for browsing the World Wide Web, Netscape Navigator.
Internet Explorer has a long way to go to catch up with Netscape.
Before most people had access to the internet, what mattered was what your computer could do. The hardware and software you owned shaped your digital experience, which, given Microsoft's dominant position, meant that Microsoft shaped your experience. But in the 1990s, the internet was becoming a mainstream platform for communication and commerce. It was a new way to use your computer, and it was outside of Microsoft's control. The most popular web browser was created by Netscape, a small company founded in '94, which quickly grew an enormous valuation. This did not sit right with Microsoft, who used their dominant position to insert their own web browser as the default on all Windows devices. If you've ever used Internet Explorer, this should piss you off. In 1998, the US Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, alleging that the company had abused its monopoly power to stifle competition, maintaining its dominance at the expense of innovation and the choice of consumers. One of the witnesses who testified was Apple's senior vice president of software engineering, who said that Microsoft had written steps into its operating system to ensure that a QuickTime file, Apple's video format, would not operate reliably on Windows, thereby tricking the user into believing that QuickTime technology is part of the problem actually caused by the Windows operating system. The court found Microsoft guilty and ordered the company to be broken up into two separate entities, which, as you might have noticed, didn't happen. Microsoft appealed and reached a settlement agreement under which they had to be more open about allowing other software on their OS, specifically sharing access to their application programming interfaces, or APIs, with third-party companies. Apple, meanwhile, were starting to do okay. They got some momentum with the release of the iMac in '98, but they wouldn't catch lightning in a bottle until the release of the first iPod. Actually, that's not true. The first iPod sold fine, but it was not an immediate smash hit, in large part because the first iPod was only compatible with Mac computers. It was the second generation model that introduced Windows compatibility, allowing the iPod to be adopted outside of Apple's existing user base. And it was from there that things really took off for Apple, later leading to the iPhone.
This feature, a lot of people thought we would never add until this happened. The second generation iTunes doesn't just run on the Mac, but it runs on Windows too. Exactly the same thing. This is not some baby version of iTunes or the music store. It's the whole thing. iTunes for Windows is probably the best Windows app ever written.
Would this Windows compatibility have been possible without the settlement agreement between the DOJ and Microsoft? Possibly, but you can be sure that with the DOJ breathing down their neck, Microsoft wasn't going to intentionally suffocate the Windows version of iTunes the way they'd try to do with QuickTime and Netscape. And note that though Windows was the dominant OS, Microsoft certainly wasn't taking a 30% cut of every song you bought on the Windows version of iTunes. Why did Microsoft make these questionable decisions? Why was Netscape such a threat? Well, web browsers were platform independent, a type of middleware that made users less reliant on the operating system that was Microsoft's cash cow. If software and services moved to the web, the underlying operating system and hardware wouldn't matter as much, and users wouldn't be as tied to the Windows ecosystem. You can probably see where I'm going with this, right? Web browsers made devices more interoperable, and interoperability, I would argue, is empirically a good thing for consumers, no matter how bad it might be for monopolistic tech giants interested in exponential profit growth. I want you to remember what Apple had to say about Microsoft intentionally breaking QuickTime and making it worse on the Windows platform. Because they are doing exactly the same thing to competitors and independent developers today. Allegedly. Before we get into Fitbits and green bubbles, let's clarify what's actually being alleged here. Apple has a goal of locking users into their ecosystem, and creating a great ecosystem of hardware and software that makes people want to stick around is not illegal. The question is whether they've used their dominant position to screw people over. Polymatter spends a lot of time on what Apple customers think of Apple products, and the DOJ does allege that Apple's goal of stifling competitors leads to it making its own products worse. But what the complaint really focuses on is Apple's use of its dominance to impose contracts and rules that restrict the behaviors and design decisions of companies other than Apple. So what contracts and rules are they talking about? Well, when the iPhone launched in 2007, it had limited functionality compared to what we're used to today. There were no third-party apps, just the ones made by the company. But within a year, Apple had launched their App Store with 500 applications from independent developers, a number that has since grown into the millions. Because this was such a new type of technology, there were no regulations forcing Apple to open its new platform and allow developers in. But they chose to do so, and it was a good decision, both for consumers and for Apple.
If you want to check snow conditions on the mountain, there's an app for that. If you want to check how many calories are in your lunch, there's an app for that. If you want to check where exactly you parked the car, there's even an app for that.
If you want to get the potholes filled, well, there's an app for that.
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 Without having to do the hard work of programming themselves, they had turned their phone with an iPod into a device that could do seemingly anything.
To the morning of your dreams, only from Oscar Mayer.
I love the smell of bacon in the morning. But the lack of regulation meant that there was no oversight for how Apple wielded their newfound power. Whenever a new innovative app came into being through someone else's hard work, Apple didn't just benefit from the increased value brought to the iPhone, they also took a 30% cut of the sales price of the app. And if you made any purchases in that app or started any subscriptions, Apple took a cut of that as well. This is why you can't start a Spotify subscription in the app. Spotify doesn't want to give away 30% of its revenue, and who could blame them? What exactly are developers getting for that 30% fee? For years, Apple told them they were paying for promotion, but then they started charging additional fees for promotion, and if you don't pay up, your competitor probably will, and don't worry, we'll put them right at the top when someone is searching for your app. But hey, at least Apple got another $4.4 billion for these new ads in the App Store. In his book, Techno-Feudalism, Yanis Varoufakis calls this cloud rent, and he describes the App Store as the first cloud fief. In a feudal system, all the land belongs to the monarch, who grants lords custody of parcels of land, with the responsibility of extracting value from that land and the associated peasantry, all while paying taxes back to the top. Varoufakis' thesis is that capitalism is dead, and we are back in that system with cloudless monarchs like Apple and Amazon exploiting the lords beneath them, who in turn exploit the peasantry, meaning us. He describes how companies like Uber, Lyft, Grubhub, and DoorDash wired into their cloud fiefs a vast array of drivers, delivery people, cleaners, restaurateurs, even dog walkers, collecting from these unwaged piece rate workers a fixed cut of their earnings too. A cloud rent. Varoufakis claims that Amazon and the App Store aren't marketplaces because monopolies have long since been established. The reason that companies like Nokia, Sony, and BlackBerry never built app stores of their own is that it was too late. With Apple quickly cornering the market, third-party developers couldn't waste resources developing for platforms with fewer users, especially not while giving up 30% of their profits to their overlords. Now, if only there was a way that apps could work between platforms. The second way that Apple illegally exploits its monopoly, according to the DOJ, is that they use their control over app distribution to enforce rules and contractual restrictions that stop or delay developers from innovating in ways that threaten Apple's power. Two examples of this are the restrictions they've imposed on so-called super apps and cloud streaming. Though these are different technologies, both are a type of middleware that open new possibilities for users and thereby threaten Apple in the same way that web browsers like Netscape threatened Microsoft in the 1990s. They weaken the user's dependence on the Apple ecosystem, super apps on the software side, and cloud streaming on the hardware side, and thereby threaten Apple's income both in terms of cloud rent and iPhone sales. A super app is one that can serve as a platform for many smaller apps, but it's not the same as just putting a bunch of apps in a folder. Unlike apps from the App Store, these smaller programs can be created using cross-platform languages like HTML and JavaScript, meaning that you only need to create one version of each and it would run just fine on any operating system or browser. So besides making it easier for consumers to switch phones, the versatility of super apps could be a real boon to developers looking to tap into the economies of scale that exist across both iOS and Android. But it won't surprise you to to learn that Apple only wants you to program using their approved programming languages and hardware, meaning that your work can't be easily ported elsewhere. The complaint quotes an Apple manager who stated that allowing super apps to become the main gateway where people play games, book a car, make payments, etc. would, quote, let the barbarians in at the gates. While there's no official ban on super apps, Apple have done their trademark move of imposing restrictions that make it practically impossible to do what they don't want you to. For example, they've blocked mini programs from using Apple's payment system, even if you wanted to pay the 30% Apple tax, and they've banned super apps from using icons or graphics to display their mini programs. In practice, this means that there are no real super apps available to US customers. The main example of a super app that people bring up, and indeed the biggest one, and the one described as a nightmare scenario by Polymatter, is China's WeChat.
The DOJ is right. Super apps are bad for Apple. Its mistake, however, is in assuming that they must therefore be good for users. Would you want all 10, 20, or 100 of the apps on your phone squeezed into one? Super apps merely replace one monopolist with another. In the world the DOJ imagines, one super app reigns supreme across all platforms.
I really think it's weird that Polymatter tries to make it seem like the DOJ would force you to use super apps. And what's with this ominous music, huh?
You might argue that consumers should at least have the option of using super apps. But as we saw with WeChat, that's rarely how it works. Restricting super apps, yes, is good for Apple. It's also good for users. And that makes this argument a weak one.
The internet is designed differently for different cultures. Just look at any Japanese website. I honestly don't personally see the appeal of super apps designed for Asian markets. I prefer software designed to do one thing well, unlike what, say, Instagram and TikTok have become. But due to Apple's restrictions, we have not yet seen what a proper designed for Americans super app would look like. And that is entirely the DOJ's point. I mean, I'm not a fan of this whole capitalism thing necessarily, but even if you are, surely you can see how the free market is restrained here. In the same way that super apps could make it easier to switch from Apple software, cloud streaming could reduce people's reliance on Apple hardware. Given where internet speeds and cloud computing is at, there's no need to carry around expensive high-performance computers in our pockets. Whether you want to play games, edit video, or just work, we're at a point where the computing can happen remotely. As one Apple manager is quoted in the complaint, imagine buying a Android for $25 at a garage sale and it works fine, and you've got a solid cloud computing device. Imagine how many cases like that there are. Yes, indeed. Imagine. But what's good for consumers is bad for Apple. Even Polymatter agrees on this one. So Apple have done the same thing that they did to super apps. While there's no explicit ban, they've complicated their rules and app moderation to choke out this whole field of apps before it could ever bloom.
It's a very similar argument to the last one, that Apple restricts the ability of other companies to offer services that diminish the importance of owning the latest iPhone. But there's a difference. The service in question here, cloud streaming, is good for users.
Polymatter says that super apps would be bad for consumers and cloud streaming would be good, but even if you're solely focused on what's better for consumers, which is a flawed way of approaching antitrust, please consider that both types of technology could increase competition and thereby force Apple to lower their prices, which the company would be fully able to do, given that their profit margin per iPhone is more than double that of other phone manufacturers. The third complaint is that Apple doesn't just attract users to their ecosystem with superior products, they actively work to drive iPhone users away from products and services that compete with or threaten Apple. This is where the complaints about messaging, smartwatches, and digital wallets come into play. Let's start with messaging.
How do you think Steve would feel currently about the state of communication, specifically between people who aren't within the community of Apple and are part of the iMessage, but more so on the green side of things with Android? We've seen a massive divide there. So how do you think Steve would feel about adapting RCS, rich communication systems, that would normalize and streamline that?
I don't hear our users asking that we put a lot of energy in on that at this point.
It's tough, not to make it personal, but I can't send my mom certain videos, or she can't send me certain videos, and so we leave.
Buy your mom an iPhone.
Ah yes, the line that will haunt Tim Cook forever. The DOJ's complaint about iMessage is twofold. In Apple's own messaging app, they allow both carrier-based messages, SMS, and more complex messages when you contact someone else with an iPhone. That means that using iMessage, you can literally contact anyone with a phone number. But Apple does not allow third-party messaging apps to use SMS, meaning that you can only reach people who have signed up for the same app. Through this and other methods, Apple allegedly degrades apps created by their competitors to encourage people to only use their default. The second iMessage complaint relates to the famous green bubbles. If an iPhone user messages a non-iPhone user, the conversation thread appears as green rather than the usual blue, and the functionality is severely limited, with pixelated videos and unencrypted messages. Now, I don't think it's crazy to change the color to indicate that the conversation is less secure, but I do think it's crazy that Apple is choosing to make the conversation less secure. They're still using SMS rather than RCS, the industry standard for carrier-based texting, which would allow encryption and higher functionality no matter who you're messaging. SMS is an ancient technology that we've long since outgrown, and yet Apple makes you use it if you're texting anyone without an iPhone, making the conversation less secure and less convenient for everyone involved. Why?
Buy your mom an iPhone.
This signals to the user that rival smartphones are lower quality because the experience of messaging friends and family who do not own iPhones is worse, even though Apple, not the rival smartphone, is the cause of that degraded user experience. Hey, isn't that what Microsoft did with QuickTime? Apple has been able to fix this problem for years, but they've chosen not to because it's not in their best interests. It would simply make it easier for iPhone families to give their kids Android phones. Now, to be fair, Apple has finally stated that they're going to incorporate an older version of RCS into iMessage, but make no mistake, this is solely in response to regulatory pressure. Given their track record with malicious compliance, I'm not actually convinced that they're going to fix this problem in any meaningful way. And even if they do, third-party apps still won't be able to use RCS or SMS. Polymatter calls the whole messaging argument weak and says that green bubbles serve a purpose because they let you know that the conversation is unencrypted. This completely misses the point, which is that Apple chooses to make the conversation unencrypted, something that does not come up in the Polymatter video. Now, if I'm honest, I think the argument that any messaging app should be able to handle SMS isn't the strongest. I can see the benefit of having a dedicated app for texting as opposed to online messaging. But with iMessage, Apple has bundled a separate service, which would otherwise have few advantages over competitors, into their dedicated texting app. This makes the DOJ's argument a bit stronger, but I think the real kicker here is that this is the default messaging app. Install whatever apps you want, but if you try to message someone through your contact list, Apple's going to take the reins. And of course, you are not allowed to change the default. Except in the EU, because we decided that's illegal. I've been pretty hard on Apple so far, so let me tell you a quick story that will doubtless put a smile on Tim Cook's face. In a former job of mine, I won an award for fulfilling some corporate value or other, and they gave me an Apple Watch. I would have preferred a pay increase, but I thought, hey, at least it's something. Except I was then surprised to learn that my new device wouldn't function at all with the Android phone I was using at the time. It's a big part of why my next phone was an iPhone. While this was annoying, it didn't seem illegal, not with current regulation anyway, but let me tell you a different story. Years ago, for my partner's birthday, I got her the Fitbit she wanted. It worked great and she loved it until she got an iPhone. At that point, her experience became glitchy. It wouldn't sync properly and she'd always be missing steps in the Fitbit app, which would often crash. It was such a bad user experience that she eventually caved, bought an Apple Watch, and gave the Fitbit away. I'm not bitter about it. It's definitely not the reason I'm making this whole video. It's fine if devices from other companies work less well on iPhones if this is the fault of the other company. But if Apple intentionally limits the functionality of devices from other companies, as the DOJ alleges, then that does seem genuinely anti-competitive. And it's simply a fact that they don't give third parties access to the same advanced APIs that they use for their own products. So for smartwatches, you can only respond to a message or accept a calendar invite using an Apple Watch. It's not because Apple tech is superior, it's simply because Apple doesn't allow it. They also stop your third-party watch from easily maintaining a connection to your iPhone, which is probably part of why my partner was always missing those steps. Polymatter has this to say.
The DOJ is right. This is pretty clearly anti-competitive.
Alright, well, let's move on to the next section.
But there's a catch. A completely level playing field would mean less of the deep integration that consumers love about Apple.
What?
The DOJ never acknowledges this trade-off.
Maybe that's because you made it up. No one is asking Apple to make their own products work less well with one another, or to remove features that they've built. They don't even need to divert their money and attention into making products from other companies work better on their platform. All they need to do is open their APIs, and other companies will work to make it function because they want access to Apple's user base.
But what incentive does Apple have to keep innovating when it's required to share those innovations with its competitors?
We're just going to put a pin in that one. That one gets a pin. We're going to pin that. Apple has a digital wallet that you can add your card details to and use to pay for things in everyday life using the iPhone NFC chip. Apple have decided not to let any other developers use this technology, even though there's no reason that another app like Google Pay or one operated by your bank shouldn't work on iOS. Why have they done this? Well, it's the same reason as always. For every credit card transaction, Apple charges banks 0.15%. With more and more people going contactless and leaving their wallets at home, Apple estimates that such fees will earn them around $1 billion in revenue in 2025. Note that payment apps from Samsung and Google are free for issuing banks. Now, you might be saying, Jacob, as long as this fee affects my bank and not me, I don't give a shit. Besides, don't you want banks first against the wall when the revolution comes? These are valid points, but let's look to the future that Apple is trying to build. They want the Apple Wallet to be the tool that you use for everything from shopping to opening your car, using public transport, getting on a flight, and identifying yourself. Right now, if I got an Android phone, I would be okay as I have physical cards that I could put into an Android digital wallet. But in the future that Apple imagines, that would not be possible, just like my Apple Watch would be useless without my iPhone.
It's not good enough for the banks to be the underlying card that's used on one of these third-party wallets. Their concern is that once you lose that entire experience, it's just a slippery slope from there, where eventually you'll have a tech company that is actually the lender, and they don't need you behind the scenes.
Banks are right to be concerned. In 2029, Apple created the Apple Card, and they've now rolled out Apple Pay Later to compete in the buy now, pay later industry that grew nearly 1,000% in the US from 2019 to 2021. 7 major banks have come together to try to compete with their own digital wallet, but they have very little chance without access to the tap-to-pay technology that Apple is hoarding. Simply by limiting this access, Apple can extract monopoly rents from banks for access to the Apple user base, while at the same time making that user base more reliant on Apple in the long term. Now, if Apple had actually produced a superior digital wallet that people chose over competitors, this would be a non-issue. But it is only superior, and Apple can only get those extra billions by locking competitors out and limiting how we use the expensive-ass pieces of tech that we fucking own. I'm no staunch defender of banks, but I don't think that Apple eating up more and more of the overall economy would ultimately be better for consumers. In the end, we would still be the ones paying. That's simply how monopolies work. They undercut competitors and leverage their size to grow, and then they drive up prices. It may sound like a good deal in the short run, but someone ultimately has to pay because the goal under capitalism is always unfettered growth. Just one more thing on wallets. In an ideal world, my bank and I are the only ones that know my card details. That certainly seems like the most private and secure option. But if I want to tap my phone to make a payment, Apple won't let my bank manage that transaction. The company inserts itself into the process and demands that I share my card details directly with them, adding a fun new point of failure. Apple often touts itself as a champion of privacy, but something's not quite adding up here. It sounds like this might be a case for...
Jacob Burrows, privacy champion. Jacob Burrows, privacy champion. Jacob Burrows, privacy champion. Put those IP addresses down, ma'am. It's alright, ma'am. I'm a privacy champion. Privacy champion. Looks like someone's about to unsubscribe. Permanently. I guess their firewall wasn't fireproof. Your little fishing operation's over, and the only thing you caught is a prison sentence. You'll need more than incognito mode to hide. For me.
See, I told you. By signing every customer up for our newsletter, we've made number go up.
Good work, employee 2018. You're getting a promotion.
Amazing! What's my new salary?
It's the same. But you get to do 4 people's jobs. Now, go ahead. Write your LinkedIn announcement. Today, I am thrilled to announce the next step on my fungal journey. Alright, who's the cookie monster around here? Do you have an appointment? Yes, I do. Privacy champion. And you've been processing data without consent. It's just business, Mr. Burrows. It's not business. It's personal.
Please, I was only following orders. And besides, don't you own an iPhone? You criticize society and yet you participate in it.
You have the right to remain silent. And the right to be forgotten.
Of course, this thing means absolutely nothing. It was awarded to me in one of my previous jobs in the tech industry before I quit my job to make YouTube videos like an absolute moron. I only flaunt it now because I think it's funny and to illustrate that I've always been a privacy advocate, and I do find the surveillance capitalist society we live in absolutely absurd and mind-numbingly infuriating. So I am overall on board with the small wins Apple has given us to support their marketing claim of being privacy-focused. No other tech company has so successfully tied their brand to the value of privacy. But make no mistake, this is marketing. I do like that you can easily turn off tracking for most apps in iOS. Generally speaking, anything that makes Mark Zuckerberg upset is probably a good thing. But in the end, it's not like this is a sacrifice for Apple. They are simply preventing other companies from modifying the behaviors of their users, something Apple prefers to do themselves. They spend a lot of money advertising themselves as privacy champions, while choosing to compromise your privacy and security in selective ways that help to up their revenue. We've already talked about how Apple forces you to use outdated, unencrypted messages when texting in order to get you to buy your mom an iPhone. They force you to share your financial information with them if you want to use your phone to tap to pay, even though that information could easily remain confidential between you and your bank. And Apple also accepts billions of dollars from Google to make them the default search engine on iOS, even though Google are the original surveillance capitalists and there are many more private browsers, a fact Apple is well aware of. That last one is part of why Google has already been judged an illegal monopoly in a US court, and we'll see how that one shakes out in appeals, but hey, it's a start. And maybe, just maybe, these could be the winds of change. Though I agree with a lot of what the DOJ is saying, I don't think that this is a slam dunk. It would be a cleaner case if Apple simply had a ban on cross-platform smartwatches, for example, but Apple has gone for a subtler approach, exercising control by tangling you in red tape and fees. The DOJ alleges that the 5 items in the Polymatter video are only examples of an illegal pattern of behavior that has a cumulative anti-competitive effect. They also reference Apple's long history of malicious compliance. Once cornered by regulators, Apple will allow something, but make it so difficult or expensive that it becomes unfeasible. For example, there's the Spotify problem that Polymatter brings up.
You can't subscribe to an app like Spotify in the Spotify app. Until recently, Spotify was prohibited from offering a button that takes users to its website, where they can subscribe. Spotify is banned from telling you this with words. It can't even communicate freely with its own users. Even today, after Apple amended its rules in response to criticism, Spotify still can't offer users a button to its website because they'd have to pay Apple a 27% commission.
After a 5-year legal battle, the European Commission ruled against Apple on this matter, slapping them with a €1.8 billion fine. Apple's response was to change their rules so that, yes, you are now allowed to include an external link in your app, but they also invented a new 27% fee made for payments outside the app, hardly an improvement over the 30% in the app. When Spotify decided not to include a link and instead just display the lower prices you could pay via your web browser, Apple said, no, we're not going to allow that. You have to pay 27% or you can't even tell people the price in your app. So the matter has now gone back to the European Commission. By the way, Polymatter says that this Spotify problem is only brought up once in the complaint, which is technically true, but the whole source of the problem is the 30% Apple tax, which is referenced throughout and ignored by Polymatter, who instead brings up measures that Apple has taken recently to shift their policies. And it is true that Apple is currently making moves to adopt RCS, allow other app stores, allow web browsers to use their own engines rather than Apple's, and allow the changing of default apps. But it is also true that all of this is just in response to regulatory pressure, specifically the introduction of the Digital Markets Act in the EU, which has made many of Apple's behaviors outright illegal. It's why many of these things are only happening in the EU, and even here, regulators will probably need to drag Apple kicking and screaming every step of the way. Because the DMA is a new law, Apple is currently testing what it can get away with. For example, while they've been forced to allow other app stores on their platform, Apple have invented a new fee to charge for installations and updates of any apps that get popular in these new app stores. As a developer, you'd get charged 50 cents per user over 1 million, which might not sound like a lot, but you'd have to pay even if your app is free or freemium, meaning that if you have 10 million downloads and 10 million in sales, Apple would charge you 500,000 per month, adding up to 6 million per year, so 60% instead of 30%. And I know these numbers are correct because Apple helpfully created an official fee calculator. This is a deterrent to get people to stay in their lane and do what Apple wants. And that is what Apple does. They fight for the right to subjugate their competitors, drain them of resources with bogus fees, and use Apple defaults to edge them out. You can be damn sure that Apple doesn't charge itself 30% when you set up Apple Music instead of Spotify. Because Apple holds this dominant position and because they're the highest valued company in the world, they can afford to be this belligerent. Other companies can't put up a fair fight, meaning that it is up to our governments. And we are right now seeing landmark cases against giant tech companies. But policymakers around the world will only continue this work for as long as it is popular, which is why public opinion matters, which brings us back to Polymatter and the question of bias. For explainer channels with high production value, it can be easy to forget that there's always a person and a perspective behind what you're consuming, especially when the topics seem fact-based, like how cruise ships work and why car dealerships exist. But Polymatter got interested in geopolitics and business via high school debate, where, of course, your job is to write a convincing case. The goal of writing well-researched and compelling arguments is a great one. It makes for interesting videos. But I think the backlash against Polymatter's Apple video comes from a whiplash of people suddenly realizing that someone they thought was just telling you about something is actually setting out to convince you of something. The video is called Why the United States is Suing Apple, when a less catchy but more honest title might be Why I Think the United States Suit Against Apple is bad. To me, Polymatter sounds like someone who has only ever owned an iPhone. I could be wrong about that, but that's the type of thinking that infuses the video. For me, it's an unrelatable perspective as someone who's presumably a bit older and from a country where Apple doesn't have a smartphone monopoly. I don't think the video is intentionally biased, but rather I think it shows the power that large corporations wield in influencing us. Your culture and background is always going to affect how you think, and when corporations get powerful enough to shape law and culture, that can make their influence, though ever present, seem invisible. Does the fish know that it's swimming in water? Or, in this case, does the fish know that the stream it swims through is designed by decades of neoliberal policies aimed at exploiting common people in order to centralize wealth and power in a class of corporate elites? Yeah, I know, it's less catchy. I am very tempted to get into the history of antitrust in the US, but after my Knight's Tale video, my partner has threatened to move out if I spend another 6 months making just one video, so I'll leave that for a potential future one. But I do want to clarify why I think the question that Polymatter poses is the wrong one. When scoping the video, Polymatter says that they're only going to focus on the effect of the suit on consumers. But, to quote Cory Doctorow, consumer is only one of our aspects in society. We are also workers, parents, residents, and, not least, citizens. If our cheaper products come at the expense of our living wage, or the viability of our neighborhoods, or the democratically accountable authority of our elected representatives, have we really come out ahead? Consumer is a truly undignified self-conception. To be a consumer is to be a mere ambulatory wallet, voting with your dollars to acquire life's comforts and necessities without regard for the impact their production has on your neighborhood, your environment, your politics, or your kids' futures. Even if you do want to focus just on prices, remember that monopolies do up their prices once all alternatives have been destroyed. Polymatter calls the suit tragic, saying it focuses on the wrong things, but don't underestimate the effect even of an imperfect antitrust suit. In 1970, the US Department of Justice sued IBM, the big tech monopoly of the time, and after a 12-year legal battle, IBM won. But they emerged a transformed company, much less eager to take what could be perceived as anti-competitive actions. That's why, when they made their PC in 1980, they didn't tie their own software to the hardware. Instead, they looked around for someone else to supply the software, and what they found was a small, young company by the name of Microsoft. So, stay with me here. The DOJ suing IBM in the 1970s allowed Microsoft to flourish in the 1980s. The DOJ suing Microsoft in the 1990s allowed Apple to flourish in the 2000s. And the DOJ is now suing Apple in the 2020s. What new revolutionary technology might this bring about? If you think cool new tech can only come from Apple, please remember that they spend more than twice as much on stock buybacks as they do on research and development. In the future that Apple wants, they will use their monopoly to continue gobbling up the market and remain the highest valued company forever. But I don't think that would benefit us, neither as consumers nor as human beings eager to develop our culture, society, and planet with revolutionary new technologies. In one future, Apple wins. In another, we might. What future do you want?